Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to be talking about the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, giving you ways to get prepared and giving you a little bit of a sneak peek what to expect for this hurricane season. If you want to skip ahead to certain sections of the video, I will have timestamps in the description below so you can skip ahead if you don't want to watch the hurricane forecasting segment, or you want to know specifically more about what to expect for this year or getting prepared. You can skip to those sections in the description below. And before I talk about the this year's hurricane season, it's always good to talk about the hurricane season in general and forecasting for hurricanes as well. So, big question that's asked is, when is hurricane season? It runs from June 1st to November 30th, and that is when the ocean temperatures are favorable for hurricane development throughout the year. Even though we can see hurricane development at any time of the year, as you can see towards like the beginning of May and even some of the winter months as well in this graph to the right, it's highly unlikely because of the colder ocean temperatures are not favorable for hurricane development during those times. And the peak of this season and any season is towards the middle of September. As you can see, this big peak in the graph towards September. So that's when the peak of hurricane season really kicks in, is when the ocean temperatures are warming up from catching up with the summer months, the heat that we see during that time. So I mentioned a lot in this video tropical cyclones. It's always good to know the difference between, say, a tropical cyclone, and you'll probably also hear a subtropical or an extratropical cyclone. Biggest difference is a tropical cyclone gets its fuel from uh, warm ocean temperatures and can sometimes even just get it from heat in general, from the release from rain and cloud formation within the storm. And the subtropical and extratropical get their energy from horizontal temperature differences within the atmosphere. So that is the biggest difference. Even though all three of these rotate around a low pressure center, biggest thing is the fuel that these cyclones feed off of. Now, a great question that I was recently asked is, how do you forecast for hurricanes? Well, the simplest answer is it's a lot of different things that we look at when forecasting not only hurricanes, but just weather in general. The biggest key to this forecasting puzzle is numerical weather prediction models. And these are computer models that take in all of the current weather data, things such as satellite, ship and buoy data, aerial reconnaissance. A good example of that is the hurricane hunters that fly into hurricanes to get real-time atmospheric data. You also get radiosondes, which is a vertical profile of the atmosphere, and that's from balloons, or even sometimes sound waves are fired up in the atmosphere to get a profile of the atmosphere. You also have radar and surface observations, and all of that data comes together to create what is known as predictions of the state of the atmosphere during a future period of time. And that includes math equations and this data, and it all comes together to give us those predictions. Now, there are multiple forecast models that are used for forecasting not only hurricanes, but weather in general. And these multiple models suit different needs. A good example of this is the North American model, the NAM model that I've talked about in some of my live streams, is a regional forecast model that is good for picking out smaller weather features, while a more bigger scale global forecasting model like the Euro is good for looking at the bigger picture of a system or just the atmosphere in general. Um, and another good thing to talk about is why we use different forecast models to forecast not only hurricanes but weather in general. Um, Basically, the simplest answer is relying solely on one model can result in error. Because if you use a regional model to forecast a bigger system, you're going to probably be wrong. Or if you're looking at a bigger model looking for a smaller weather system, you're probably going to miss details that you would have not seen within, say, a smaller scale model. And using multiple models can give a general consensus of what to expect for a not only hurricane but for a system in general. And a good example of using multiple weather models is Hurricane Sandy and the European model back in 2012. Initially, the European model was suggesting a New Jersey landfall as it made a northwest turn towards the eastern seaboard. And most of these models were not on board with that initially, but as time progressed, all of the models started to shift northwest and agree with the initial prediction of the Euro. So it's always good to have a multiple takes on what to expect for a hurricane or a weather system in general. And we usually combat this error, if error does occur, by running ensemble forecasts. And these are based off of different variations of one model, each similar but having little differences between them to reflect the errors in the information that's fed into the models, or changes within the atmosphere that happen, since the atmosphere is a chaotic system that we're trying to forecast. And when you put those all together and you plot them onto a map, you get what's called a spaghetti plot. And you can see this to the right in the black is the main model that was used to make these ensemble members, or little variations within the first model. And each of these little spaghetti strands or strings within the map are different variations of the main model. And you can see initially all starting out the same but varying differently as time progresses. And that's good for taking a look at a bigger picture down the line. And that's also good for what I'm about to talk about next, which is the National Hurricane Center's forecast cone. Now, before I talk about the ensembles and models and how that relates to this forecast cone, big myth that I've heard a lot from, and it's surprising how many times I've heard this, is the cone forecasts the size of the hurricane. And that is a big, big myth. It actually forecasts the probability of the track of the center of the tropical cyclone. So rather than the size of the storm, it forecasts this little X is the center, where that center of the storm is going to track within this cone. And it's drawn this way so that 2/3 of the time, or majority of the time, the center of the storm will remain within the cone. And that 1/3 of the time can happen where the center will stray off outside of the cone. And another good thing to know is that even if you're not within this cone, you can still have the storm come into your area and affect areas very far away from the center of the storm. So very big misconception is that it forecasts the size of the storm. And so if you're not in the cone, you're not necessarily clear from getting impacts of the storm, because this hurricane can have very widespread effects, even hundreds of miles away from the storm's center. And coming back to the ensemble forecasts and the weather prediction models that I just talked about, the National Hurricane Center uses those weather models and ensemble forecasts to establish the bounds of the cone. So if, say, you have ensemble members or different models streaking within the center of the cone, that's where you're going to have the cone drawn out for the forecast. Another good question that was asked and very important to talk about is how accurate are these forecasts? In Blayton's terms, they're very accurate to a certain extent. 48-hour forecasts today are more accurate than 24-hour forecasts about 10 years ago. And then forecasts are continuously improving to this day as we learn more information about weather systems. Models are updated to fix issues, biases, and they are continually improving as we learn more data and more information about the weather. And 72-hour forecasts from hurricanes today have an average forecast error of about 100 nautical miles. And while that does seem like a big number, it is about the distance between Sandy Hook to Cape May, or the length of the Jersey Shore. And compared to 10, 20 years ago, that is a lot better, considering the fact that we couldn't even forecast as accurately within a 24-hour span. So forecasting has gotten a lot more accurate over the past decade or two. And there's always errors that occur within a forecast, and that is due to gaps within the information that's fed into the models. Sometimes there's a flaw with a computer model. There's a bias towards warmer or colder or something that flaws that computer model. Two other big factors are not all atmospheric factors can be interpreted within the model, say interactions between the wind and the sea surface temperatures or something along those lines. It can't be all interpreted within these computer models. And the biggest one is there are fluctuations within the atmosphere that can happen at any given time. And that is why forecasting weather in general is so difficult, is because the weather and the atmosphere is ever changing at all times. It's a very chaotic system. So forecasting that chaos, it's a little difficult, but we've gotten a lot better with it overall in our history of weather forecasting. And so now that I've talked about the nitty gritty of hurricane forecasting and the hurricane season, it's time to look at what we're expecting for this year. And some big factors to look at for any hurricane season forecasting is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or El Nino or La Nina, if you've heard those terms. That is the Eastern Pacific anomaly um, over the Eastern Pacific that affects weather not only in the Atlantic but also over the North American continent as well. Another thing to look at is the trade winds, which is also affected by the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, as I'm going to be saying for most of the video. Big thing to look at is forecasted sea surface temperatures, since hurricanes get their fuel off of those warmer sea surface temperatures, and also other climate patterns are important to look at for forecasting for this hurricane season. Uh, Elaborating more on the ENSO, this is a climate anomaly over the Eastern Pacific that affects weather widespread across the North American and Atlantic at any given time. The La Nina phase is favorable for hurricane development in the Atlantic, and that is the colder phase of the ENSO, and that allows for weaker vertical wind shear and trade winds to occur over the Atlantic and less atmospheric stability, and that is all good for a hurricane to develop. And a lot of hurricanes can develop out of a La Nina phase. And then there's also the El Nino phase as opposed to the La Nina, which is a warmer anomaly from the ENSO, and that's not really favorable for hurricane development in the Atlantic, only because you have stronger vertical wind shear and trade winds, and that really basically tears up the storm. With any thunderstorm, say, vertical wind shear is a very good thing, but hurricanes, these bigger systems, that will tear it up and will not allow for these broader systems to develop within the Atlantic. And that allows for more atmospheric stability, the El Nino phase in the Atlantic. So all those things combined do not allow for as much hurricane development as, say, a neutral or a La Nina phase of the ENSO. And since I just talked about that, we're going to look at what we're expecting for this year. The ENSO is expected to be neutral for the duration of the hurricane season. And we're going to look at this graph right here up at the top right. This red dot is where we're at right now. A little bit warmer than average, but for all intensive purposes, that is neutral. And taking a look at the models, they're suggesting a ENSO neutral phase for the entire duration of the Atlantic hurricane season. One or two models do stray down south towards a cooler phase, a La Nina phase, may be possible towards the later months of the Atlantic season. But overall, we're looking at a ENSO neutral phase for the duration of the Atlantic hurricane season. I did mention these one or two models, and there is the possibility of a La Nina phase coming in towards the end of the season, which would heighten hurricane activity. And then look down at the bottom right graph at the probabilistic forecast. These gray bars are the probability of a neutral forecast. Red is El Nino, and blue is La Nina. So normal, warmer, and then blue, colder. Take a look at the beginning of our season, which is right about here. Probability is very high for a neutral phase. As you go towards the end of the season, you can see that neutral probability declines, and looking even further down the line for La Nina, you can see a little bit of an increase in probability towards the end of the season. That's about right here. This drags on into the winter months, but you can see that La Nina probably creeping up just a little bit towards the end of the season. So it's still a possibility we need to keep an eye on as more information comes to us and as the months progress, getting closer towards the end of the tail season. Another thing to look at is the current forecasted sea surface temperatures. Now, the climate model we're looking at right now is suggesting above average surface temperatures during the duration of the season. For the most part, these are 1 to 2 degree differences, but those differences will definitely fuel the hurricane, since what sea surface temperatures is what the hurricane gets its fuel from for the most part. The warmer sea surface temperatures. Um, so taking a look at all of these things combined, another thing, good thing to look at is what other outlooks are suggesting as well. As you look at Colorado State University, University of Arizona, and the Weather Company, for example, these outlooks are suggesting above average hurricane season compared to the average between 1981 and 2010. You see the average is about 12 in terms of named storms, 6.4 for hurricanes, and major hurricanes is almost 3 for the about 30-40 year average. As you look at the forecast for Colorado State University and University of Arizona, they're both predicting an above average season for this time of the year. 16 to 19 storms between the two of them, 8 to 10 hurricanes, and 4 to 5 major hurricanes. And even the weather company is hopping on with that suggestion as well. 18 named storms above average from the average of 12 for this time. So other outlooks are currently suggesting that things are going to be very, very active for this time of the year. And taking all of these factors and combining them, we're also looking at a above average hurricane season for this time of the year. Now, while I'm not going to be giving definitive numbers like the Colorado State University and University of Arizona and weather company outlooks, only because forecasting specific numbers for a hurricane season is a little more difficult over the span of such a long period of time. So rather, I'm going to be giving more of a range of what to expect. So for this year, 16 to 20 named storms is right about now what we're expecting with the current information we know. 8 to 12 hurricanes and 4 to 6 major hurricanes for this year, and that's about category 3 up in terms of the category rating for the hurricane. All these factors, the above average surface temperatures, the neutral ENSO phase, and the normal trade winds for this year, it's all going to add up to a very active hurricane season and produce above average number of cyclones for this year. Now, going back to that La Nina probability, if that does come into the mix later on in the season, we could be seeing even more than this forecasted total. But at the time, we're going to have to just take things one step at a time and see how things progress with that. And so this is my initial forecast for this hurricane season. And so with all of that said, we've talked about the what to expect for this year, how to forecast these hurricanes, how to forecast for the season. Very important thing to talk about is how to get prepared for this season. First thing to do is determine your risk, and that depends on where you live. The risk would be different, say, if you live in New Jersey rather than Florida, because Florida is a little more hurricane prone than New Jersey is, but the chance for a hurricane is still existent anywhere you go within the along the eastern United States and even the West Coast as well with their Pacific hurricane season as well. So it's always a good thing to determine your risk depending on where you live. If you live by the coast, storm surge and risk currents are an issue. If you live by any body of water, there's the issue of inland flooding, and anywhere you go inland there's the possibility of tornadoes and strong wind gusts with a hurricane as well. Another thing to do is develop an evacuation plan. This is more emphasized towards hurricane-prone areas, but definitely still a good thing to plan out for in the event that local officials say you need to evacuate your area. It's always a good thing to have a plan where to go if you do need to evacuate. Make sure if you have any family members or pets, make sure you have the plan include them as well, and make sure you have multiple options in the event that something goes wrong. Another good thing to do, not only for this year's hurricane season, but just for severe weather in general, is assemble a disaster supply kit. This kit would include non-perishable food and water, medicine, any sort of over-the-counter things like Advil or any sort of medicine that you would need, or maybe even if one of your family members or even you have a prescribed medication, it's always good to have extra in the event that you cannot access a pharmacy. Other things to have include a batteries, a radio for emergency messages, chargers for all of your electronic devices in the event that your power goes out. Extra gas is always good to have on hand, and extra cash on you as well for these disaster supply kits. And it's always good to have these not only for the hurricane season, but for severe weather in general in the event that power goes out and you are not able to have power or any sort of thing for a few days. Your food in the refrigerator could go bad. It's always good to have a plan like this in the event that something does go wrong. Another good thing, this is more for homeowners, is to get an insurance checkup. This is more emphasized towards hurricane-prone areas, but it's always a good thing to do for anyone living within a weather-prone area to check up with your agent and see if your house is covered under these hurricane or severe weather risks. Make sure you have all of your documents with you, and maybe even consider flood insurance if you live in a low-lying area or along the coast as well. Another good thing to do, this is more towards if a hurricane is coming towards your area or you have severe weather coming into your area, is to strengthen your home. This includes boarding up your windows, trimming your trees, or maybe even cutting down your trees if they pose a safety risk to not only you or your family, but your house as well. Some other things to do is to secure any outdoor items that are loose, securing all your doors and moving your car to a safe location if you do need to evacuate or um, anything along those lines. So it's always good to have your items protected so that they don't go blowing around or something doesn't fall on them. Another good thing is helping your neighbor. There's always um, everyone needs help from time to time, and that especially speaks true in times of need during severe weather events, especially hurricanes. Helping your neighbors prepare, helping them evacuating, even checking up on them as the storm passes are all good practices to do when preparing for not only hurricanes but for severe weather as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is completing a written plan. And this goes for anyone, not only people in hurricane prone areas, but anyone who is in a prone area for severe weather. Having a written plan to reference in the time that severe weather does hit, it's always good to have so you know what to do and how to be prepared for any sort of event that goes on. And it's always good to be prepared for something than not prepared for something. So it's always good to get that written plan out and always have it, and it's always good to just be prepared for something. Now, with that said, that's the end of this video. Make sure you guys are preparing for this hurricane season. It's definitely going to be an active one this year, so make sure you take the necessary precautions, get your disaster kits ready, make sure you stay in touch with local officials in the event that you do need to evacuate, or just stay in tune with the National Hurricane Center or any other government agency that's giving out these forecasts and staying up to date on that. So with that said, that concludes this video. Soaring weather, tuning out for today.